Our second reading, our reading taken from the Hebrew Scriptures this morning, is taken from the book of Zephaniah, the book of the prophet Zephaniah, chapter 3 and verses 14 through 20. As always, listen to what the Spirit might speak into your life in this reading from sacred Scripture. Zephaniah 3:14. Sing aloud, O daughter Zion. Shout, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your hearts, O daughter Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. God has turned away your enemies. The sovereign of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall fear disaster no more. On that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, do not fear, O Zion. Do not let your hands grow weak. The Lord your God is in your midst, a warrior who gives victory. God will rejoice over you with gladness. God will renew you in God's love. God will exult over you with loud singing as on a day of festival. I will remove the disaster from you so that you will not bear reproach for it. I will deal with your oppressors at that time, and I will save the lame and gather the outcast. I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. At that time I will bring you home, at that time when I gather you. For I will make you renowned and praised among all the peoples of the earth, when I restore your fortunes before your eyes, says the Lord. The third Sunday of Advent already, a Sunday that has a very Christmassy feel to it for today when we think about joy, sometimes called Joy Sunday. Did you notice these lines from the rare book of Zephaniah? Zephaniah? Can you conjure a visual image of what Zephaniah is presenting here? It says, God will rejoice over you with gladness. God will exult over you with loud singing, as if it were a festival. It's beautiful, isn't it, this notion that God finds joy in you? That God rejoices in the person that you are in God's good creation. That God rejoices in you, exalts in you, celebrates you as if it were a holiday. God finds joy in you. Do you find joy in you? Where is your joy? Where do you find joy? Think of some of the people you've known who've displayed joy in their living. I bet you could name a few in your own personal life. People whose joy just kind of went with them wherever they went. Not all joyful souls are Mr. Fezziwig, that jovial, kind-hearted old moneylender in Scrooge's Christmas Past. Many joyful souls are just ordinary people living their lives. And the joy of their lives becomes apparent in their living. If you're as old as me and maybe even a little bit younger, you might remember Bob Ross, the guy who used to have a painting show on TV, and he taught people how to paint landscapes and trees. If you remember him, his paintings, on their own merit, they would not hang in museums. This was not fine art. There was nothing about the man to hold your attention either. I mean, this was the 70s and 80s. He had an afro, which was curious for a white man. His voice was a lullaby. Like Mr. Rogers, you look back on these unglamorous shows like this, and you wonder, why were they so popular? They would never make it out of the gate today. But he loved what he was doing, and he would say things like, let's put a tree right here, a happy little tree. It's there inside your brush, he would say. All you have to do is push it out. Anybody can paint, he said. All you need is a dream in your heart. How about some happy clouds flying overhead? Ooh, here they come. And then he would say such a beautiful thing. This is your world. Your creation. Just listening to the man talk about painting made you feel as if maybe you could paint. made you feel as if maybe there are possibilities in your life that you haven't explored yet, that you haven't tried. Maybe you could create and then love your creation. And though he was no Van Gogh, and he was certainly no entertainer, he was possessed of a quiet joy that drew us to him and kept him on the air for 11 years, without flash and without gimmickry. You know, back before cooking shows became known as Smackdowns and Cake Wars. Oh, come on, you know what I'm talking about. Their popularity depended not upon competition, but upon the simple joy that the chef brought to the show. Julia Child, even the Cajun chef. They brought their love for their art, and we watched them because of that. There was no winner and no loser because their joy was just a contagious thing. It appealed to the creativity that all of us humans possess and long to live into. The creativity that we share in common with our Creator. I just told the kids I don't like math. And I think if I had had a joyful math teacher, I might. And I'm sure there are such things out there in the world. I'm sure that a math teacher once stood at her board with chalk dust on her fingers back in the days of blackboards, waxing philosophical about integers and absolute values, as the students sat back there in their desks and wished with all their hearts that they could just bite their thumbs off. She loved her job. She loved nothing more than sharing the joy of numbers with the next generation. The order, the certainty, the balance, the form, the clarity of numbers. The presence of joy somehow makes anything more convincing and more urgent. When I showed up at Colgate-Rochester Divinity School, I was the first student to arrive at our very first class, and there was a tiny old woman in the corner shuffling papers. I greeted her with a smile the way you always do with a stranger, and I assumed she was the cleaning lady getting the classroom prepared for our class. She was very small, and she was really old. I mean, to be teaching, she was in her 80s. Not that that's that old. She was older than I expected. And more than that, she was dressed in the same polyester pants and comfortable shoes that my grandmother used to wear around the house when she was spending a day cleaning. But she approached me and she offered me her hand and she said, "I'm Dr. Moore, I'm your professor." To my great shame, I admit that my heart sank just a little bit. I had been working in the parish for 5 years already, and this little old lady was going to teach me how to preach? She explained that she was actually a Roman Catholic nun, but that she loved Presbyterians because her bishop did not allow her to preach in Catholic churches. And the Presbyterians did allow her to preach in their pulpits, and I thought, nice. She's never had a pulpit of her own. Her own church won't let her preach. And here she is teaching me how to preach. And she's dressed like the cleaning lady. But within minutes, she flew into life. She just came to life when she started talking to us about preaching. And her love of it was clear. It was a real joy for her. She knew it inside out. And she helped us to know it better too. She had insights and wit and wisdom and a way with words. She was good. She was possessed of that joy which you can only know when you really love the thing you're doing. It was not mirth, it was not giddiness, it was not hilarity, and it wasn't even always fun. But it was joyful. It possessed elements of passion and delight. Joy is that deep pleasure which has no victim and does no harm. It's the simple delight in the moment at hand. It's a happiness so keen that it makes you to know that you can be open to other happinesses as well. The presence of joy in one area of our life enables us to expect joy in other areas. For once joy has drawn back the curtain of your soul, you see that there is a hidden depth, a richness, a wonder to being alive. Joy in any domain, whether it be mountain climbing or model trains. Joy reveals the deep truth that our lives are not meant for mere drudgery, competition, dull demands. Joy opens new vistas out onto the otherwise hidden sacredness of your life. It speaks the truth that despite sadness and despite pain, there's also this beauty, meaning, possibility. The simple delight of ear and eye and tongue and touch and nose. There is joy. And wherever there is joy, God is there. And so I ask you, where is your joy? Where is your joy? Today we get an unaccustomed glimpse into the book of the prophet Zephaniah. He is among the most minor of the minor prophets, the 12. And we only ever pay a call upon Zephaniah in Advent, this season of waiting and of longing and of yearning. And yet Zephaniah really comes through here. He comes through with a fresh image for our holy imaginations to explore, a fresh image of the divine. Zephaniah says that God rejoices in you. God exults in you. God perhaps even dances as if it were a festival. This creates an unexpected picture in our minds. God rejoicing? God singing, God dancing, perhaps, celebrating as if it were a party. And what is God celebrating? God is celebrating God's good creatures, God's creation, you and me. God is finding joy in you. And you and me and God, we all find joy in our creations. And why is that important? I think that's important because we have all kinds of images of God floating around in our imaginations and in our history, and some of them are helpful, and some of them are good, and some of them are overused, and some of them are forgotten and misunderstood, and they've lost their meaning, but others are downright abusive and scary and unhelpful. We have some images of God as the stern, bearded man. I'm not sure how well that one has served us. We have the doe-eyed Jesus. We have Christ on the cross. We have the dove and the flame and the lamb. The lamb. Many of these are good, but which of them are actually joyful? How many joyful images of God do we have? And how have we forgotten this most beautiful image of God as the merrymaker? M-E-R-R-Y, the merrymaker. God is one who sings and dances for joy, for the simple joy that God finds in God's own creatures, in you and in me. Whatever doubts you have about God, whatever mixed feelings you have about yourself, know this. God takes joy in you and calls you into a life of joy. The French priest, scientist, and mystic Teilhard de Chardin said, "Joy is the infallible sign of the presence of God." Joy is the infallible sign of the presence of God. Then it would stand to reason that an absence of joy is a pretty infallible sign of the scarcity of God. I don't mean to criticize another culture, but I once lived in a country where the pastors, the clergy in general, were all very serious. The clergy there seemed to think that it was a breach of clergy ethics to smile. Laughter among them was almost unheard of unless they'd been drinking. And I wondered about this until I got to read one day their official rules for clergy conduct, and believe it or not, every church has those. You don't need to read ours. But they actually said in the rules of clergy conduct, a minister is supposed to be grave and serious. And I wondered why. Where did they get that? Why does a minister have to be grave and serious? Is there not joy in faith? Is there not joy in church, in community, in what we share? We have all known people whose lives have been marked with joy, despite and sometimes even because of suffering. And from those people, we could not look away. And we've all known other people whose lives were marked by a conspicuous absence of joy. And from them, even though we love them, we cannot get away fast enough. Here's a general rule of thumb to keep in mind when thinking about faith or your profession or your relationships or politics or life in general. Trust joy. Trust joy. People can simulate humility. They do it all the time. They can manufacture some insincere serenity. They can pretend to be concerned or kind or generous, but joy you cannot fake. When someone tries to fake joy, you see right through it because it's the stuff of our hearts. Offering a human being bogus joy is like trying to get a fish to swim in vodka. It looks the same, but it's not. Even a broken heart knows better than to be fooled by counterfeit joy. And where there is joy, there is God. You know, in these days, when old hatreds are being given new life, in these days when bigotry and misogyny and racism and xenophobia and homophobia are fashionable once again, wouldn't it be nice if more clergy, politicians, teachers, police officers, attorneys, homemakers, if all people could find their joy and live more fully out of that? If all the world's broken people were plugged into their joy, don't you think all would be well, or at least most would be well in our world? Joy. It's the birthright of every being created in God's image. And where there is joy, there is God. Joy to the world. Joy, that most appealing, most mysterious, most comforting characteristic any human can possess. It draws us to another person the way the old electric can openers used to make the cats come running. And yet there is a real shortage of joy in our world today. So much so that I think we have stopped expecting it. Think about it. Would PBS still broadcast a show like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood with its unglamorous, simple joy? In the 21st century, what would Bob Ross be doing? He wouldn't be on TV. He might be teaching painting classes at the community college. Julia Child might be working back in the kitchen of some pricey bistro between Columbus Circle and Park Avenue. These quiet souls would go about their joyful lives unknown to the world if their day were this day. Why? Because, like God, we find our joy in creativity, but our society doesn't necessarily want us to create. It wants us to consume. It wants us to spend money. It wants us to buy. It wants us to spend. And in the absence of joy, we will settle for lesser things. Give us mirth, give us hilarity, give us material gain. Give us power, or at least the illusion of power, I'll take that. Give us wealth, give us fame. Real joy is the goal of every human life and the desire of every heart. But we will settle for excitement, for a thrill. And then, I couldn't leave him out today. Enter John the Baptist. John, the wild man of the desert. What is he doing so close to Christmas? What is John doing here? Do you think John was a joyful man? He always shows up in our Yuletide preparations as he does today, bidding us Merry Christmas, you brood of vipers. And yet I like John, and I like his presence at our Christmas preparations. I'd like to see locust-shaped Christmas tree ornaments, honey-flavored Christmas cookies, maybe gifts wrapped in camel skin. Not real camel skin, artificial camel skin. John was a serious man, a true ascetic. And I've used this joke before, but the only thing John the Baptist and Winnie the Pooh had in common is their middle name. But his is not the artificial joy of achievement or attainment or enrichment or material gain. His is the joy of turning away from all the shiny stuff that does not matter and setting our hearts on the things that do. It's the joy of setting relationships aright. It's the joy of social justice. He says, whoever has 2 coats, give one of them away to somebody who doesn't have one. And do the same thing with your food, and collect no more than you need, and be satisfied with enough. John's is the joy of right relationship toward our belongings, toward our neighbors, toward ourselves, toward God. That joy is not cheap. But joy it is. It is the infallible sign of the presence of God. And you? Has it ever occurred to you, perhaps not because we rarely read Zephaniah, has it ever occurred to you that God sings for joy in you, in the person that you are, God's good creation and a source of God's joy? You could sing for joy in you too. You can sing for joy when you find that spark of divine creativity in yourself and you live into it and you make it a source of blessing for the world. Practice your joy in this holy season. Practice it in such a way that its goodness and its light pervade your attitudes and your relationships. But more than that, do not forget that you are God's joy. God finds joy in you. Amen.